Hi, everybody. I'm Ollie Thomas, founder and managing partner here at Expedition Growth Capital, and I'm delighted to be joined today by our operating advisor, Jeetu Mahtani. Hi, Jeetu. Great to have you with us today.
Hi, Oliver. Thanks so much for having me here. Excited to have this conversation today.
Great. And just for everyone's awareness, we're extremely proud to be partnered with G2. He has a remarkable track record of impact and value creation in growth software companies, most notably scaling HubSpot's international business from, I think, $3 million of an inception, G2, to something like 600 at the time you left. Is that right?
Yeah, it was about that number. It was a fantastic journey for HubSpot as we expanded across Europe, Asia, and Latin America. So yeah, that was a fun part of my time at HubSpot.
Excellent. Well, we're looking forward to getting into a few of the challenges that European companies particularly experience as they're expanding their businesses internationally and specifically into the US. And so let's jump into a few questions. So first up, G2, what signals would you look for in determining whether a European software company is ready for US entry?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, Ollie. And I think, I would answer this in almost like I would look like for like four green lights. I think these are like four things I generally would keep in mind. I think the first green light that I feel strong about is what I would call like, is your pull greater than your push? So with that, what I mean is like, is the US market pulling you in? Are you getting some initial demand? Are partners expressing interest? Essentially, the market is sending you like a signal that, hey, you are being pulled into the US and you need to pay attention to this. So I think your pull should be greater than you forcing your way into the US. The other thing that I would think about is it's an investment when you're going from Europe to the US. So you need to think about like, are you ready to make that investment? Like, do you have a strong foundation to push forward with that investment? So I would be thinking about like in your core market, in this case, if you're a European founder and you're in the UK or all across Europe or in key markets in Europe, what does your customer dollar retention look like? Are you able to acquire customers and keep them and ideally even grow them? And then with your finance partners, like how do you think about LTV to CAC? Like, do you have a good model in place where you know, like, what is inputs to output? If you put in $1, what do you get from a return standpoint? So that's the second green light is like, do you have a strong foundation from a unit economics standpoint? The third green light I would think about is see this happen often is like companies go from Europe to the US, but they don't really have like a repeatable sales process in play. You want to make sure when you're entering the US, you're ready to graduate from like founder led selling to actually you built like a product market fit playbook and go to market fit playbook where you've got a process where you can think about like exit criteria, ICP, sort of like how do you take that motion and move it to the US? Because if you show up into the US without really having something that is more repeatable, you're going to take a long time while you're burning cash in the US without like showing a return for it. I'd say the last one that I would think about from a green light standpoint is almost like, are you ready to localize not necessarily what you sell, but how you sell? So the way you sell in Europe is going to be different from the way you sell in the US. So, from a messaging standpoint, are you able to share value-based messaging so US prospects understand like, how do you actually help them solve problems or help them grow better? US prospects also think about like from a messaging standpoint, are you compliant from a security standpoint? Let's say SOC 2 compliant. So if you're entering the US to like sell into enterprise, you better be SOC 2 compliant, else you're going to get pushed into lengthy sales cycles, which usually will not result in a positive outcome because you just don't like check all the boxes. So that's the way I would think about it, Oliver, is like European companies looking into the US. I think about like, is your pull greater than your push? I think about like your foundation and unit economics. I would make sure you have some form of a repeatable sales playbook. And this is something you'll always iterate, but you got to have a good V1 that you can bring to the US. And the last one is not necessarily what you sell, but how you sell. Are you ready to localize how you sell?
Yeah, that all really resonates. As you know, we're focused on partnering with bootstrap companies that are capital efficient. And so that first criteria being pulled in is a really common characteristic. I'm interested to pull on the thread of the point 3 that you made around sales playbook and specifically how you think about ICP, because we've noted that, one of the drivers of more efficient US market entry is clarity around the specific ICP profile that companies are targeting. Have you got any perspectives you can share on that?
For sure. And this is where, like, if you don't get your ICP right, then you're probably going to be shooting in many different directions. And when you're coming to the US, like, you want to be in some ways, like, precise. Like, do you know who is your ICP? What are their pain points? What value do you bring that solve those pain points in a unique way? So you sort of like want to get that ICP to some level nailed. Then I would also think about like the ICP. Are you thinking more like PLG from a go-to-market motion, or are you thinking more enterprise from a go-to-market motion? Now, with PLG, you could actually probably run a lot of your go-to-market for that ICP from Europe. You may be able to actually extend your timeline to be a little bit longer before you actually come in country. But if your ICP is more like mid-market enterprise, where there is a true like buying cycle where you need to be consultative in your prospect and your selling experience, then you're going to need to think about like, how do you engage with that ICP in person in the US? So think about sort of like, where is that ICP in terms of like, say, average deal value or average contract value? And then think about like how you as a business will think about your functions and how your functions can engage with that ICP. Maybe just to unpack this a little bit more from a function standpoint, and I see this as a common scenario, is like you're coming from Europe to the US, and the natural question is like, how deep do I go in terms of all my functions being in the US? I always like to think of this as almost like a hub and spoke model, like you're a European headquartered company or a European based company. So your hub is in Europe. You can create a spoke in the US. And how do you do this to a level where you're able to lean on the hub without having to duplicate all these resources in the US? So with that, what I mean is, for example, let's just say if you look at the flywheel, there is, of course, it starts with like awareness where your marketing team plays a role. You could probably get marketing going well in advance before you actually have like an in-country presence. This is back to like, how do you create pull and not push? So I'll think about like, keep your marketing in your hub in Europe, get your marketing efforts going to start creating some pull with inbound or with demand. Do some PR, do some awareness campaigns. The other would be natural, like as you get some demand going, how do you actually engage with that demand? Now, if it is PLG, of course, you can drive like more digital motions, but if you're more like mid-market enterprise, you need to get someone sitting in country. It could be maybe an expat that you move from Europe to being as your first individual or team member in the US. And then that individual is going to need help from marketing that is sitting in the hub. They need help from customer success. I would actually try and keep CS in the hub to some level until you get some like predictability going with that first AE who's on the ground. So that's the way I would think about functions, is how do you sort of like lean in your hub, because that's where all the magic already exists, where your chances of making an error is much lower. As you get pulled into the market, let's figure out how do you maybe send an expat to the US who can start like engaging with that demand and start getting you some early wins.
Yeah, that's a fascinating sort of cross-functional view. How about leadership? Have you seen patterns of success around founders moving or senior culture carriers moving? How do you think about that?
Yeah, this is where like I always say, when you're going into the US, if you get it right, you're going to accelerate your growth by 2-3 years. But if you get it wrong, you're probably going to decelerate your growth by 12 to 24 months. So that's sort of like getting off the gate is so critical. And so much depends on like the culture, the focus on winning. And it's really hard to like start from ground zero when you're going from Europe to the US and try and create that culture that already exists in your European office or in your European presence. Which is why I think, to your question, like I love when the founder or someone from the leadership team is actually that first person on the ground. And that first person on the ground may hire maybe a first AE or two. It's almost like this 1-to-1 or 1-to-2 match where you're going to give the first few hires, almost like your local founding team, all the attention and focus and enablement, So you're going to set them up for success. And when that founding team actually starts winning, the word gets around the local region that hey, this is a company you should go join. So getting those first few wins create this really nice, good momentum that you can lean on to drive like other rock star hires into the future. Now, when I think about the founder, like I would encourage the founder, like pack your bags and move to the US for some time. Could be 3 months, could be 6 months for a couple of reasons. One is like what I mentioned, like your early hires are going to see the founder sitting right next to them and they can see like we're totally committed to winning in that market. It also sort of like the founders, or, when you're a founder, you're usually, I would recommend being in founder mode, which I know is a term that is a little overused, but the idea is like you want to obsess about the details. What is the market telling you in the early cycles? So how do you create that feedback loop between the founder and the product organization, the marketing organization? And then I think your first many wins, you are in some ways, of course, selling your brand and your value prop, but to some extent, you're also selling your founder. They're buying because your founder or your leadership team brings a unique perspective on that problem. And they're like buying into your vision as a founder on why they should be engaging and doing business with you. So I would encourage someone from the leadership team or maybe even the founder, ideally, pack your bags, be in an office with your first few hires. It just creates a lot of good energy to sort of like create this desire for the rest of the team that, hey, we're getting all the support, so we better do what we need to do to win in this market.
Right. And I think that really resonates if you look at Renault at Ringover packing his bags and going to Atlanta, or the folks at Fabric who have set up a really strong Boston hub with a senior leader for Paris who's on the ground there and hiring great talent around them there. So yeah, that'll really resonate. So what questions would you ask a founder to really pressure test before green lighting? Now's the time to put boots on the ground in the US.
Yeah. What I would be pressure testing is firstly, like what I mentioned earlier on, like, is there some pull from the market or are you having to push? And with pull, I would be looking at naturally, like if you're a European based company, you're still probably going to be found in the US, or you've already run some initial marketing campaigns in the US, maybe even some paid campaigns. Like, what is sort of like the success of those campaigns? Like, is a market like showing like commitment? Like, yes, actually, this is a problem I'm facing, and I'm going to convert maybe into some inbound leads or inbound demand. The other is, what I mentioned about the foundation, Oliver, is it's really hard when you're in one geography, say in this case, Europe, and you're going to the US, you're sending a message to your team that we are initiating a new leg of growth. And they're going to be looking at like, well, is our existing leg of growth actually doing well? Like, are you showing that we in Europe are a successful business and we're ready to make that investment in that second leg of growth? Now, this is a way for the troops to see, are you focused? Are you doing the right business decisions to create a long-term, durable, and sustainable business? So back to the foundation, what is your attainment for your AEs in Europe? Are they doing well? Are they beating their target? What does your customer dollar retention look like? Do you have awesome product market fit? Because you're not just winning with AEs, but you're also able to service, onboard, activate them, and show these customers that they can, gain ROI from their investment with your company. So I'll be like pushing on the unit economics. Like, do you know your unit economics like the back of your hand? And are you super clear that your unit economics are telling you you're ready to go and create that second leg of growth? The third one that I would be pressure testing is some of the prerequisites that you need in place to be able to win in the US. Like, for example, have you thought through compliance and security? Do you have your SOC 2 compliance in place? And, that depends on what segment of the market you're selling into. But this is where like some of these prerequisites, you don't need to wait till you enter. You can actually get this sort of like done before you enter. The other I would be pressure testing is like, what does your leadership bench look like? Do you have a bench that you can count on to be able to help you win in a new market? Because if you have a leadership team that isn't like, pointed in vectors in the right direction, you see it in the numbers, you're going to create a big distraction for your leadership team when you're ready to enter the US. Now, you don't want to be creating distractions when they're distracted from an execution standpoint. So this is where like, is a leadership team ready for this expansion? And ideally, do you have someone in your leadership team that's not going to make this US expansion their side job? Because if you make it their side job, it's only going to get you average returns. Are you ready to pick someone from your leadership team to say you're the driver to help us like enter and win in the US? And in some cases, the founder may be that person. He or she might tell the leadership team, you guys are going to keep running the business here, and you're going to help ensure we're successful in Europe while I'm going to go and plant some seeds in the US for the next 6 months, get the first few hires going. And then you guys are going to go back and forth as we get more hires and more functions up and running in the US.
Yeah, I love that real focus on strong foundations in the home markets as foundational to success.
Yeah.
Obviously,
And I think this resonates with your portfolio, having worked with many of your companies. Like they're operators, they're bootstrapped, they have a good foundation on their unit economics. So I'm hoping this is just natural for them to say, yep, this makes sense. Let's validate it before we make this investment in the US.
right? Yep, totally agree. Could we switch to the enterprise opportunity? For some of our companies, the enterprise opportunity in the US is really compelling. I'm also mindful of the depth of your experience around customer care and the ownership that you had of the sort of North Star NRR metric at HubSpot. And I'm really interested in advice you'd have for European companies preparing to go and address that enterprise segment in the US. What do you need to win customers, but also to retain and grow those customers as well?
Yeah. Yeah. Having done both SMB at HubSpot and then enterprise at ShipBob, where I'm right now, it's very different. And, maybe I'll start with enterprise, which is what you're asking, Ali. You just have to be ready to work with like committees as opposed to an individual, which is what you typically do in SMB. And as you go to enterprise, depending on whatever stat you read, say from Gartner, any typical enterprise B2B sales cycle has 6 to 10 stakeholders. So are you ready to be able to do things like multi-threading? It's going to be mandatory to be able to multi-thread across functions, across the organization, to be able to move your sales cycle forward. And each of these stakeholders, whether it's the CEO, the CFO, the CIO, have their own sort of like unique challenges where you need to be able to personalize your value proposition for each of those individual personas. Now, with enterprise, what I would also encourage European founders to think about, like besides like, of course, one of them moving to the US, at some point, you're going to need to go and hire an account executive, right? Hopefully in the first few months. A mistake I see many founders or many companies make is they'll go and hire an AE from a name brand, let's just say a Google or a Salesforce. You want to hire someone who's maybe just one stage ahead of you because you're really early in the US and you need someone who's going to come in, one, be able to deal with chaos because it is going to be chaotic, right? Your early days. And two, they're going to need to roll up their sleeves and be able to work across these multi-stakeholder engagements and do it more or less on their own with some support from the hub in Europe. So if you go and hire folks from like big brands, you're going to struggle. You want to hire someone who's just maybe one stage ahead of where you are as a company. The other is you're going into enterprise. It's a very, what I would call like systematic process. And there are multiple steps and stages you need to go through. You should be ready to prove like the ROI of your product and what does it actually do for customers from a return standpoint. So I'll be thinking about like ROI calculators, maybe even TCO, a total cost of ownership. So you can bring that point of view to these enterprise buyers. And this is a lot of work you can do before you actually come into the US. The other thing that I would be doing is at some point, enterprise buyers are like, this is great, but give me one of your existing customers I can talk to, right? And now this is going to be a little tricky because if most of your base is in Europe, then what do you do? So what I tell founders in Europe is like, that's okay. Think about the use case. If you are clear about the use case that you're solving for the buyer in the US, and that same use case is something that your customers in Europe deal with, that's okay. What you're really solving for is pain, not really like are they in the US or in Europe. So get a lot of that in place, like case studies, reference accounts, ROI calculators, and build some of that enablement material to support your, let's say, your expat who moves over or some of your first few hires.
Yeah, and I guess that all rhymes with the ICP discussion as well, because if you've got clear view of where your existing customer base gives you a right to win. What are the segments that you've been successful in Europe that are, or the use cases where that's a bowling pin somehow to knock over your initial ICP segment in the US? That's a path to more efficient entry somehow.
Absolutely. I mean, this is where like it's all about like, the number of times you're batting and what is your batting average. Like if you don't get the ICP right, you're going to end up with a really low average from a home run standpoint. You're going to strike out often. Starting to get into a bit of baseball analogies over here, but hopefully that will still make sense for European founders. So yeah, absolutely. I think getting the ICP clear is like probably one of the prerequisites that I see a lot of folks not stress about. And then they're surprised when you don't see a good conversion rate or a good win rate. The other thing that maybe just to round up the conversation around enterprise, Oliver, is when you're going enterprise, they are going to be spending naturally like bigger dollars, right? Like your ACV is going to be higher. So they're going to expect a level of service. So from a response standpoint, for example, like if they have a support question, what does that look like? Like how quickly can they get an answer from your team if you're not staffing support in the US and your support is based in Europe? So think about like maybe how do you sort of like get like extended hours with your support team in Europe to support your US customers until you get to a certain like customer base in the US? I would think about like your customer success team. How are they going to support your US customers if assuming you're not getting CS up and running as part of like your landing operation? So these would be the things I would be thinking about is like, how do you demonstrate we are committing to the US market and you're not only dealing with the AE in country, but here's how we're going to support you from a leadership standpoint. Someone's going to be your executive sponsor. We're going to make sure our post-sales team is accessible in your time zones. So those are the things I would try and like push for, especially in the enterprise side.
Yeah, I'd love to follow that thread and how it relates to the person that is going in country, because there are times when it makes sense for the founder to relocate. And there's other times where the right thing for the business is for the founder to stay in the home market. What are the characteristics you'd look for in a senior person who might go lead the US effort? Because I can see that there's a dimension there of being a talent magnet. You want somebody who you can build a great organization around, but also somebody who builds confidence with US accounts. Wise a founder if it's not the right thing for them to physically move? What would you look for in the early employee or whoever the right culture carrier is?
Yeah, it's a great question. And to give us a bit of a framework, in some ways, like there's a phase zero, which is almost like pre-entry. Like, how do you create more of that pull versus having to push through marketing and other sources? Your phase one is a bit of what you're asking is who is that person if it's not the founder? And your phase two is you're sort of like starting to hire more local talent and you're starting to scale your US operation. On that phase one, in terms of like what I typically would look for if it's not the founder in this case, it's someone else, is I would send someone who has a proven track record of success in the European business. If it's, a manager or an account executive, like they've shown that they can take on challenges, work through like complexity, and they know how to like coordinate with the organization because especially say it's enterprise selling is team selling. So if you're sending someone who's too junior and who doesn't have the attention or the alignment with the rest of the org, that person's going to take too long to like be able to succeed in the US. So I would like make sure a proven track record of success can deal with complexity, has shown they can deal with complexity and in some ways the unknown. They have the respect and trust of the rest of the functions and the organization in Europe. So, you're going to be highly like responsive to this individual when he or she's based in the US. I would also think about like, how do they think about like hiring people? Are they good talent spotters? Have they hired and shown they can not just hire them, but they can be player coaches where they're winning customers, but they can also be coaches and ramp these early hires in the US. So those would be sort of like the things that I would be looking out for. I also think there will be good and bad days when you come into the US. It's just natural, right? And if you have someone who has sort of like signs of longevity, they've proven that when they have a problem, they don't give up in 1, 2, 3 months. They're willing to stay with it. There will be some going forward 2 steps, going back 1 step. There's going to be forward, backward, sort of like these motions when in the US. Have they shown they can deal with that longevity that is needed when you're in the US? So if you send someone, don't send them for 3 months or 6 months. That's going to fly by very quickly. I would almost see it as like a 1 year assignment at a minimum for that person to be based in the US.
That's awesome. Thanks, Jeetu. Well, this has been great. Maybe just to wrap, if there's one single piece of advice you'd give to a founder who's about to expand, what would that be?
Don't wait for demand to come on its own. You're going to have to be deliberate about creating that pull versus push. So think about your go-to-market channels. Some could be inbound, some could be channel partner driven. Like try and get the wheels moving over there before you come to the US. Not a perfect example, but when we took HubSpot from, say, the UK to Germany, before we had our first boots on the ground in Germany, we actually spent 18 months on the PR demand marketing side to create a bit of that pull. So when we entered with feet on the ground, we already were able to go and execute on that demand. So make sure you make those investments and start spending time well in advance of physically entering the US. The other is don't underestimate the importance of getting those first few hires right. If you need to make an investment to send the right person in your team to the US, it could be expensive because it's sort of like a reload. There's going to be some expat expenses. It'll feel expensive. Your CFO is going to probably question it. But in my experience, getting that right person is absolutely going to give you a payback over time. But if you shortchange that investment and just send someone too junior, you're going to struggle. Like be thoughtful about who are you sending and be ready to like show commitment on that individual. The third is like culture. Like be ready to invest in culture. And this doesn't mean like take your culture from Europe and transplant it to, I don't know, Boston. That's not typically how it works. What I think you need to be ready to do is like there are certain values that work for you in Europe. How do you make sure those values still exist in your US presence or US office, but also make sure you give them the flexibility to be able to create their own winning culture? And the way you do that is by partnering with them, the leadership team, the founder. At HubSpot in the first year, someone from the executive team would be in Dublin 1 week per month. It happened every month consistently. They would be on the floor, in the front line, in the coal mine, working with the early hires to help them like shape a winning culture and partner with them to do whatever is needed to win. So that's what I would be recommending founders think through as they think about their US expansion. In the long run, and knowing your portfolio, like it's an incredible portfolio, and I know they want to be smart and efficient with the way they grow. I'll just encourage them to think about like, if you fast forward 10 years, what does your install base look like? If you look at the S&P 500, which is the 500 biggest companies in the US, over half of them get their revenue outside the US. The parallel is if you're a European company, long term, what percent of your customer base is going to come from the US market? So I would see this as, not a sprint where you can sprint and say, did I get there or not? This is going to be more of a marathon. So when you're ready to run that marathon and you're ready to commit, that's the right time to do it.
This has been such a rich conversation. Thanks so much, Jeetu. Very grateful. And thanks also for, all the great work you're doing across our portfolio.
Yeah, anytime. Excited. And as folks listen to this and if they have any other questions, happy to engage with them.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeetu.
Thanks, Al.